Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be in this age of Zoom events and pandemics. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, and I want to welcome everyone to this, which is the first in a series, actually, of what we hope will be some fun and provocative events on how an important and dynamic region has changed and is continuing to change economically, politically, institutionally, strategically, and then what the scope and nature of that evolution mean for the United States. Now, just by way of background, because it's the first in a series, we're calling the series A New Order for the United States and Asia. And to be blunt about it, that's a purposefully provocative question that's embedded in that framing, as I said to my fellow panelists here, and that is this: will Asia's future be more Asian than Pacific? And I say provocative because in my experience, at least, a lot of Washington-based debates in particular about the region have a tendency to simply presume American centrality in the region in all things and in perpetuity. But the fact is, as any observer of the region knows, Asia has changed a lot after some key inflection points over the last 25 years. First, I would argue after the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 98, then again after the global crisis in 2008, and then of course over the last 4 years, not just in response to President Trump's choices, but also as some longstanding institutional processes and developments have come to fruition. And so, to put it simply, I happen to think that the region that President-elect Joe Biden will step back into on January 20th will not be the same one that he left behind when he left office in January of 2017. And so today, to kick off this series, we have a fantastic trio to help us to begin to think through that. You know their biographies, so I'll be quick about it. First, we have Ambassador Heng Chee, Ambassador at Large of Singapore, former Ambassador to the United States, permanent representative to the United Nations, and one of the most trenchant thinkers that I know about this region. We have Mike Froman, former United States Trade Representative, but also Mike involved in a lot of seminal American economic engagement in the region going back to the Clinton administration. And we have Shivshankar Menon, former Indian National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary, and another deep and trenchant thinker about this part of the world. So, team, thank you for doing this. And to begin, I thought what I would do, let me put two propositions on the table as a way of kind of provoking you a little bit, and then you could agree or not agree, but at least it gives you something to react to. All right, first proposition. When I think about American leadership in Asia after 1945, but particularly after the 1960s, there really were two pillars to it. The first was a security pillar, of course, because the United States, through its alliances, forward deployed military presence, carrier battle groups, was the principal provider of security-related public goods that kept the peace, particularly in East Asia. But that wasn't the only pillar. There was obviously also an economic pillar because the United States was the demand for which Asia's export-led economies power their way to prosperity. And it was a central player in setting rules, norms, and standards. So when I pull the thread and I look down the road, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific until China and Japan have a moment that's a little like what France and Germany had in Europe after 1945. And so the United States will continue to be a central security player in the region as a strategic balancer. But in the economic realm, on nearly every metric, trade, investment, project finance, the US role is rising in absolute terms, but declining in relative terms as other players rise. And so as the demand profile shrinks, the US role as a standard setter, rule writer, norm setter should become even more important. But, and this is the first proposition, the United States seems to be walking away from that role, not least through its walk away from trade agreements and other processes that Asians have then advanced in the absence of the United States. Which brings me to the second proposition, which is that increasingly Asians seem to be making pacts and reaching agreements without Americans in the room. And so we have two trade pacts now, for example, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, neither of which includes the United States, and Shankar, neither of which includes India, by the way. And so across the region, as I said, intra-Asian trade is rising. And Asians are looking to one another, not just across the Pacific, for capital, for knowledge, for ideas, for data, for technology, and so on. And so these things, too, over time may become institutionalized on a pan-Asian basis, which raises the question, whether you agree with that framing or not, whither the United States in the region and what role for the US in a region where Asians look not just across the Pacific, but increasingly to one another in these ways. And so I wanted to start, you don't have to react to those propositions directly, but maybe with you, Heng Chee, by asking you to talk about whether that's the right way to think about the region, but in particular, whether 4 years after President Trump came in, whether the former vice president steps back into a region that's similar institutionally, politically, strategically to the one he left, what's changed, what hasn't, and what's he going to discover?
Thank you, Evan. Actually, Evan, you mapped out a very good picture of what is happening in Asia, but then, of course, is your area, and you've done, in fact, a brilliant article on what happened in the past. Is Asia rediscovering its own connection? I want to make 2 points first, which is one, yes, Biden and his team, the president-designate and his team, should take note that Asia has changed. Asia has a new sense of self-confidence, and they have a sense of their own agency. I would also add, America has changed, and Asians must take note of that. And I think what we are discovering and suddenly hoisting in is that America is very divided. United States is very divided. And so how do you move ahead? There's so many good things you have to offer there. You have leadership in some areas, but how are you going to act internationally? I think that's in our minds. Now, I want to elaborate on some of the points that you have made just to make the point. You are right. America used to produce security and economics, the economy. Today it is split. And for a long time, Americans and Chinese always said, Asia looks to America for security, to the Chinese for economics. And I think that's what is happening. And there will be, America is changing its role relatively to a rising China and a rebooted Japan and India that's wanting a role. And even Australia, everyone wants a role now. And I would say that during the financial crisis, during the global financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, and because of President Trump's position, and not only because of him, because President Obama also was questioning. He was a reluctant global leader in many ways, and this was a reaction to the unilateralism. But President Trump and America First made us wonder whether America is retrenching its interests. And given that everybody in the region wants to act, make up for it, and you get new coalitions. Japan signing up everybody for strategic cooperation. Even Korea is coming in, Australia, Japan, and so on. I think your audience probably knows all this, but the COVID experience has really shocked the region. And I think there was patent disbelief in Asia as the country struggled with COVID, that we see America handling the problem so badly. You're the country of science and technology. What happened? And I think the elections were an eye-opener and continues to be an eye-opener. So this is what has happened. So the recalibration has to do partly with not just the absence or the withdrawal, but how America is performing, shall we say. So I think the United States should accept that Asians will want to act on their own. They form many groupings, but we are also becoming a multipolar region. And the United States may not like that. You are a hegemon, predominant power, but we are becoming a multipolar region. They are still asymmetrical poles. At the moment, the United States is the top pole. China is catching up. So there will be two leading poles. Then there's a Japan, everybody else. And you will have to come in to consult and listen. I better stop there because I've taken a lot of time. I'll come back.
Thanks. Well, actually, you gave us a lot to chew on there. So, so we'll come back around on some of that. But Shankar, can I ask you, do you think it's correct to say that Asians are looking more to one another for solutions to the problems that bedevil the region than may have been the case 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Or is that the wrong way to think about it?
I think it's the right way to think about it because for three reasons. One is with what has happened to the global economy in the last few years and the crash that COVID has brought, people look within the region now for sources of growth. Last year, China accounted for 40% of the growth in the global economy. And post-COVID, so the economic appeal of looking within the region, in a sense, globalization is being localized. And the free trade agreements that you're talking about, RCEP, CPTPP, NAFTA, or its new name, and EU, all these in effect are localizing globalization. And that's sort of problem. I think that leads people to look within. But also the balance of power has shifted, even particularly naval power. I mean, there's no question that if you look at the response to what has happened in the Asia Pacific or the Indo Pacific, why have so many countries now increased their defense, security, intelligence cooperation, whether it's Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, India, and the others? Because they see the balance shifting, and they now think they have more agency and capability in security than maybe when the US was the provider of security in the region. I want to support one thing that Heng Chee said, which is we need also to be aware that there is increasing attractiveness of other models to the US model. And I think that, and it's not just the economic attraction or to putative authoritarians who see various advantages in other models. But it's also the fact that, frankly, the narrative is gaining hold that power has shifted and that the future is here in Asia. And COVID, by breaking the world down into bubbles, and because East Asia, Southeast Asia have recovered first, actually, from it, is actually accentuating that sense. And I think that's something that needs to be dealt with and dealt with seriously. I'll stop there.
Okay. Mike, can I turn to, can I get you, I mean, obviously the United States, it's a Pacific power. And if you look at, I mean, just look at investment figures, right? US investment, even just in the 10 ASEAN countries alone, I think is 225 billion plus, dwarfs Chinese investment in terms of inbound FDI. So for all the talk about China, the US is still present, but that's business. That's not strategic momentum. That's not government as a standard setter. That's not rule writing and so on. And business will adapt to whoever's rules. So particularly given your role on the TPP negotiation, when you look at those two agreements, for example, how should Americans think about their absence from those? Is it meaningful? Is it as meaningful as people say it is? Does it suggest something about strategic momentum, or at the end of the day, does it not? How concerned should we be about that if we're thinking about a long-term American presence and posture?
Right. Well, look, I agree with much of what has been said. I think, and as I've said many times before, I think the withdrawal from TPP will be seen in retrospect as one of the greatest strategic blunders in recent American history. Having said that, I'm not holding out great hopes or expectations that a Biden administration is going to rejoin the CPTPP, but rather have to explore other ways of engaging with the Asia Pacific region on economics in a leadership way. RCEP from the size, the number of countries, the populations of markets covered, is a significant agreement. But its standards, to be frank, are relatively low. It's a low ambition agreement. It's not an effort to really advance the rulemaking, the standard setting that TPP represented. And of course, CPTPP basically represents largely what we negotiated in TPP. So I think we continue to have influence indirectly by virtue of our presence there at the beginning. I do think the U.S. is going to need to figure out a way of re-engaging, because while I completely agree with what Shankar and Heng Chee have said about the changing nature of what's going on in Asia, the ability and willingness of Asia to come together on its own in a number of ways, there still is a great desire for U.S. to be engaged and to show leadership. And the more China's dominance becomes evident, the more outwardly focused and explicit some of its values and principles have become in the exercise of both economic diplomacy as well as security and other issues, the more the countries in the region want the U.S. to be there, not necessarily to contain, but to balance, to partner with, to have an alternative. And I think the U.S. can play a vital role there. I do think, and by the way, this is not unprecedented. Remember, TPP started with Singapore and Australia and New Zealand and Chile, even before the U.S. got involved. The work that is being done in the region, I'll just give you one example on the digital economy, that Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Japan, Korea, all working together to begin to define rules around the digital economy. Very important, less politically controversial than a free trade agreement, but a possible area that the U.S. could engage in, which is important, not just to have an alternative vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis with the European Union and others to begin to work together to set rules of the road for next generation issues. I think there is great potential for us to use that as an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all those other players that are driving the action in different areas, because here's something that's always puzzled me. When you hear the strategic class talk about the region, what you often hear is that the future is either America's to win or it's China's to win. It's a very bipolar framing of the region. And I'll give you an example. If I just rewind to when President Obama, and Mike, you were there, you were USTR, used to talk about the TPP when he was selling it domestically. And I get it, this was domestic, it was for political effect. He had a phrase he used in an interview once. He said, if the United States doesn't write the rules, China will write the rules out in that region. And if that had been true, then by logical extension, when President Trump withdrew the United States from TPP, what should have happened? China should have come in to become the rule writer. It's that very bipolar framing of the region. Of course, as we know, that's not what happened. We ended up with the other 11 driving toward the agreement, albeit with a text and with principles, as you said, Mike, influenced by the United States, but with neither the United States nor China in the room or as party to the agreement. And so the future of the region is clearly much more diverse and potentially actually more fragmented than just this US versus China framing. And so whether it's trade agreements or it's data governance, where, for instance, India refused to sign up to this Japanese initiative, the Osaka initiative, there's just a lot of diversity of players driving it. So I think she used the word multipolar. Is that multipolarity or is that just fragmentation? And does fragmentation mean what we're going to get is order, or does it mean just a discombobulated patchwork of rules, norms, and standards in which nobody's really driving the play? Heng Chee, maybe I'll start.
I hope it is not disorder or fragmentation, because these Asian countries, ASEAN and Australia and Japan and all the others, believe they are building regional groupings mechanisms to provide order. All these regional groupings are providing order of a sort. But I'd like to come back to your point about this bipolarity. Is it US and China? Is it just these two poles? And I would say that with the region, you always say, and people laugh, the region says they do not want to choose. Don't make us choose. It becomes almost a joke, but it's true. And it's not just Asia or ASEAN. Even in Europe, they don't want to choose. And you know what? You underestimate what the United States and maybe China underestimates is that you are seeing a group of countries, important countries, middle-sized countries, incoherent. They're not in any organization, but they all have the same desire. They want to be friends of both powers because there are strengths in both powers. And they see that that engagement is important. So they will choose, on security, you may have more people signing up with the United States because I think the element of trust is still there, although they believe, hey, you can let us down, but the trust is there. China has to learn to build that trust. And, they are not yet there. So on security, people will go more with the United States. On economics, they'll go a lot with China. So, I see like between the two poles, you have these discs and people are sliding the disc between the two poles. Every country is trying to do that. And if all of us do that, what can you do? You're not going to choose. You can't force us to choose. And so it's not that you are there, but you cannot dominate the conversation alone because we are finding ways forward. And the fact, I like to quote this example frequently because during the pandemic, Canada brought together Brazil, France, Germany, Indonesia, Italy, Morocco, Mexico, Peru, ROK, Singapore, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. China was not there, United States was not there. And all these countries pledged to pool their research and scientific resources together to share findings. They do not want China or India China or US because they do not want the politicization of science. We're choosing our own path. So I think you're going to see that. But no, it's not fragmentation. There's a purpose in why they are grouping and they're trying to find a path forward.
Chandra, is that how you see it? Third countries are choosing their own path? They're choosing their own path, or function is driving form, and people are just organizing around different functions in different coalitions?
For me, it looks like different issue-based coalitions of the willing. Function. And depending on the issue, you get a different group. So function is driving form here. But it also seems to me that the big trend and the big change that I think President Biden and his people will find is that Asians have much more agency. This is not about just China and the US. And my favorite example is, even if China and the US agree to denuclearize North Korea, is that going to happen? I don't think so. Because I think the North Koreans have their own interest and are quite capable of continuing on their path. Similarly, if you look at the other flashpoints and hot points, whether it's the India-China boundary and so on, even if China and the US, two greatest powers on earth, decide that this is the way forward, that doesn't guarantee that it happens. So there is agency in this situation. And I'm not just talking about economic choices, and that I think is the biggest change that the new team will find when they come, that people have got used to actually making choices and working with others in smaller groups and it's not random, because it is conscious and an attempt actually to create something multipolar. India staying out of RCP actually at core is a bet on a multipolar system and on globalization continuing, rather than fragmentation and regionalization, if you look at it. By the way, India is the exception even on the economic side. In 2019, the US overtook China as India's biggest trading partner. So if you look at it, things are changing in unpredictable ways. I don't think 3 years ago anybody would have expected this to have happened. So it seems to me your basic point is right, but I think the order that's emerging is a much more complicated order than bipolar order. I don't think we're going bipolar.
But so we're going, but not fragmented. It's just different, distinctive functional.
The only analogy, which is close but maybe not ideal, is late 19th century Europe. Now, we don't like where that ended, but it's different powers at different levels of power, of capability, jostling among themselves and finding partners for different things. This is post-concert of Europe, pre-World War I, and that's the part that we don't like, right? So I do think we need to pull up our socks and start thinking about these things seriously, because I think there's a lot of tinder lying around, but I won't go into my pet song of how the arms race in Asia has actually, and all these flashpoints and basically geopolitical rivalry and China-US contention has created a situation where we really need to start thinking seriously about security.
Mike, can you pick up, not where Shankar left off, but more if I can rewind you back to the middle of where he was, which is this idea of function driving form and fragmentation. So first, do you accept that the region is heading toward kind of a diversity of standards in different functional areas? And if you don't, why? And if you do, how does the US posture itself for that kind of diversity?
I do agree with that assessment. And I think Shankar used the word coalition of the willing. I'd use the coalition of the ambitious, that I think countries can come together around various issues in various groupings to push the agenda forward. And again, digital economy being one, data being another. It could be over some trade-related issues, environmental goods, healthcare, and making sure that vaccine nationalism is addressed in an appropriate way. So there may be ways that countries could come together around this. The risk of that is, particularly in the economic sphere, is if you've got different coalitions doing different things in the same area, you do risk that fragmentation, and you do risk the deglobalization that Shankar was warning against. And so, I'll use the technology example. Do we need, if different parts of the world and different coalitions are heading in different directions, how do we stitch together global rules? Is there a role left for global rules? And do we need some kind of forum that brings together regulators and governments to share perspectives, similar to what we did in the financial system after the global financial crisis and the Financial Stability Board? Do we need a similar effort around technology, whether it's around the digital economy, whether it's around data, whether it's around the use of technology, around AI, around surveillance technology, cybersecurity, things of that sort, to begin to put in building blocks that could lead to global solutions. The danger of the coalitions of the ambitious approach is that you really do end up with an archipelago of standards. And that's not an effective way for some of these issues to be dealt with. And so can you use them as building blocks towards a greater global approach?
So can I push you on that? What strikes me is there have been some attempts to do that. But they've foundered on the reality of diversity of views, even in countries that are supposedly like-minded. I'll give you an example. I mentioned this cross-border data initiative before, right? So Prime Minister Abe had this Osaka initiative, which was supposed to be about cross-border data access and transfers. And what struck me were, well, one of the countries that refused to sign up, this is what struck me, was of course India. Yeah. So if I now back up from that to the way the US seems to be thinking about the region, if you listen to US rhetoric, there's a geographic frame on it, which is Indo-Pacific. And then there's a functional frame on it, which is that there's some kind of latent coalition of the like-mindeds that will be the posse of like-minded governance. And implicitly, it's not Chinese governance. But each of those seems somewhat problematic to me. Indo-Pacific, because as I said earlier, Shankar, in the trade area, what is Indo-Pacific if you have two agreements now setting rules and standards for a generation that don't include the largest economy in the Indo and don't include the largest economy across the Pacific? So if you don't include the Indo or the Pacific, what is Indo-Pacific geographically, at least in the economic area? And then on the coalition of the like-mindeds, the core of that for the US has been the United States, Japan, India, Australia, but on data, for instance, couldn't get Japan and India onto the same page. So whether it's geographically constructed or it's functionally constructed, it's not clear to me whether, even if the United States has the right strategic concept, the functional reality is keeping up with the ambition of the way Washington tends to think about it. Is that the case, or is it Does that mean we need to alter our concepts, or does it just mean that reality is requires a little bit of a tweak?
Evan, can I just come in here?
Yeah.
I think the many countries in the region talk of inclusiveness. Indo-Pacific strategy, you don't get a common definition. And Australia, even Australia talks of inclusiveness. And ASEAN has come up with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is inclusive, is open to everybody. So I think you talk of writing rules and everything that you want to do. If it's going to be global rules, it had better be a platform that accommodates everybody and brings everybody in. And you can start bargaining. And, China always complains that it was never there at the creation, for WTO, for IMF, World Bank. So now can we all sit down and do something? Because, with the change to President Biden, I've asked myself, do you think you all can work on the reform of WTO? Can you work through, using G20 as a start to play around with the ideas? And, US is not happy with it. China is not quite happy with it either. They want to be there at the creation. What can you work out? And global rules for the digital economy, for the whole technology, use of technology, cybersecurity and all, that's very much needed. How are you going to get that conversation going?
But
I think part of the problem is that we face growing digital nationalism. This idea that data is the new oil, which is not true, but it's this idea that somehow I need to protect it. The server should be in my country, and this has spread wildly. It's not just, it's true in India, certainly, but look at China, look at Russia, everywhere you look. And I'm not sure where we can break it. It seems to me that what Mike was saying is the only way, where if you can start with a group of countries, and as he said, the coalition of the ambitious, but you need to offer it as open, as inclusive, as Heng Chee said, but you need to start somewhere and start, because today what's happening is that privacy, data protection, cybersecurity have all become protectionist measures, quite frankly. And these are the latest non-tariff barriers that we actually deal with. And we have no way of dealing with it. And frankly, going back to WTO or to the old frameworks is not going to work. It won't work politically for any of us. So we need to offer something new. We need to at least change the framework in which we deal with it. I think maybe Mike knows how we can do this.
I completely agree with Shankar on this. I think, and some of it is because these are new issues and rapidly evolving issues. We need to be able to differentiate between the absolutely legitimate issues around privacy and protection of individual information. And in this case, the EU has been a leader on the regulatory side with GDPR, which is spreading around the rest of the world, whether it's official or not official, as the standard. But to distinguish between that and digital protectionism, there are many ways of achieving the legitimate privacy concerns that governments have without losing the benefits that come from an open digital economy. And one only needs to look at COVID and the importance of being able to share information across borders. Imagine if we really were living in a world of bifurcated or balkanized internet, data protection rules, localization requirements across the board. It didn't have information about health outcomes to share across borders. We'd be in much worse shape than we are now. So this is a ripe time to take up those issues. I like Shankar's view of take the coalition of the ambitious, but do it in an open and inclusive way. You've got to start someplace. And my guess is over time, problem is we don't have places to have this conversation right now. The G20 hasn't been effective in that. The WTO isn't quite right for that. And so finding new forums where we can bring together countries to have this conversation, dig down into the details, and try and strike the right balance, I think remains important. And then using that as a way of building a broader sort of institutional framework, I think would be useful.
So, Mike, who would be on something like that, who would be the ambitious? And how would the United States both tactically and strategically drive the play on that? Because if you think about countries in the region, India has a privacy bill. The United States is not necessarily happy about the general direction on that. Localization requirements on data in India, in China, neither of those the US is particularly happy with. So how would the US, to go back to where we started, which is this leadership role, how would the US drive that, and who would the coalition of the ambitious be?
So I think you start with some of the parties in the Asia Pacific. You start with Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Japan, Korea. You've got provisions in USMCA and provisions in CPTPP, which are decent starting points. The UK has recently agreed to similar provisions in their arrangement with Japan. So I think you begin there. That's a pretty good starting point. I think you could reach into ASEAN. You ultimately need to have a conversation with Europe, and where they're very much on a aggressive regulatory approach. And this is a good time to have that conversation to see if we can strike the right balance. India is a challenge. And I think to Shankar's point, we have to be able to distinguish between digital protectionism and legitimate public policy concerns and try to address the latter, but not allow the former to serve as an obstacle. But I think if you begin to get that, you begin to create that bulwark around a new digital economy framework that others can then join and be open to joining. China has a very different approach. You're absolutely right. But that's why you need to have coalitions of the ambitious coming together to set up an alternative, and people then can decide which way they want to go. But I think ultimately this is both an urgent need and an opportunity to help refresh global governance in the economic sphere.
Can I just add to that? I take climate change as an example, renewables, for instance, where if you look at the distance that India has traveled over time, over the last 10 years, it's really considerable. And this is not because of external pressure, but because of domestic developments. And it's driven by domestic economics, actually, and politics, and a middle class, which is now saying, do something about this. This is a serious problem. And I think it's the same with digital. I think you need to have the conversation and actually put these ideas out there. Because today, frankly, there's no discussion at all. In the public sphere, it's the only ideas you see are digital nationalism of one form or another. So I think we need to start there.
Just to build on Shankar's point, and India is a great example of this. If every country followed a digital protectionist, digital nationalist agenda, none of India's services business could survive. India is the greatest importer of data from other countries that supports the whole back office processing industry in India, the whole service related industry in India. And so it benefits greatly from cross-border data flows. And to
so
Shankar's
you need
point,
to get
over
them
time,
engaged in the discussion.
India.
Yeah.
India. So actually, that's interesting because I'm seeing questions are starting to pop up from the audience on this side. There's one that speaks directly to that. So this is from Micah Hymans, who comes in through YouTube, and she directs it at Mike, but I kind of want to direct this at Micah and Shankar because it gets at India. So the way she framed this was, she said, what do you make, this is for Mike, of the e-commerce chapter, including the ban on data localization in RCEP? And the reason I want to throw this to Shankar is that she also asks whether that was a reason for India to drop out of RCEP. The data localization provisions within it.
Should I? The simple answer is no. I think it was much more Indian worries about being flooded by Chinese goods. Already we run a $53 billion deficit, or we ran a $53 billion deficit with China in our trade last year, out of a total trade of $93 billion. And I think that was the core concern for Indian industry, not the data localization part. maybe Mike can do the rest of this.
Yeah, I think I think the disciplines around data localization, preventing it, allowing free flow of data, again, consistent with privacy views, is important. I think the challenge is, and as I understand it, RCEP has some pretty broad carve-outs, including for national security or national interest, that may constrain the utility of that provision. Whereas CPTPP, USMCA, et cetera, and the agreements that I see Singapore and others negotiating around the digital economy are stronger in that respect. So I would use those more as the baseline for going forward.
So Heng Chee, so RCEP was, it was an ASEAN-centric agreement. It's funny because the media talks about it as a China-centric agreement.
They say it's China, it's not true.
Yeah, it was an ASEAN-centric agreement. So how much concern is there that India dropped out? I mean, obviously, it made it easier to get to an agreement in a sense, but strategically, there was a reason to.
But I don't think that we are happy about it, and we would really like to bring India into the agreement if we are able to. Oh, it's tough, but we really would like India to come back, and then whether other countries would want to join. Are there other new people signing up? I know that there's some candidates that have been thought about.
You mean beyond the ASEAN +6?
Yeah.
Huh. And Shankar, just to flip that to the other side to you, I've noticed that a lot of the domestic rationalizations in India for the dropout, there's the China angle, but there's also all of this talk about self-reliance and the domestic market. And I've wondered whether India isn't spending a lot of time into trying to defend what it has, is somehow missing the other side of the ledger, which is to grow the opportunities, particularly given that exports have been a pretty good story for India, actually, if you look at the data.
Well, there's still a big argument going on about it. I mean, there are a lot of people arguing that it was a mistake to walk away from the RCEP.
Yes.
I'm one of them. I mean, there are others who who feel that we should be in there, and that to admit that you're uncompetitive is one thing, but to say that you're going to be uncompetitive for 20 years, I mean, that sounds to me a bit ridiculous. But anyway, that's just my opinion. But it's still not a settled argument. It's going to be hard, yes, politically, for a government once it's walked away to work its way back in and so on. But that's a different issue. But it seems to me that the case for staying open is very strong. And the government itself now has been trying to define self-reliance in ways that, say, no, it doesn't affect the openness, we're not going to. The trouble is that if you look at actual behavior over the last 4 years, tariffs have been raised every year, RCEP. There's obviously a struggle for the soul of this government. And I don't think this is settled yet. And so I'd be careful actually just closing the book and saying, okay, that's final and that's it forever. But I'm not sure how we're going to work this, because India is tied into the region. And our prosperity does depend on what happens in that region, whether we like it or not. And that I think most people recognize. But whether we can renegotiate the terms now in a way that is politically acceptable, that I think is the big question. Let's see.
So of course, Shiv, RCEP has been signed. There's still the certain details which are not fully negotiated, and I think the next step for RCEP countries is to work on the work program and agree what they're going to do. So in that sense, but maybe you already don't like the template, which is actually rather low ambition, So the question is, what can bring India back?
Yeah, well, I wish I knew. I don't have an answer to that. And not only am I not an expert, but, not in government. So.
But can I pick up on the last thing you said, Shankar, and then throw it to both you and Mike? Because it seems to me the United States and India may have an analogous problem. Let's say the United States hypothetically let's say at the retail level, it managed to politically make the decision to try to go back to CPTPP. And India made the decision to go back to RCEP. both those countries might regard the existing text as the floor, whereas the countries that are in the agreements that made all these political choices, trade-offs, sacrifices, might regard it more like a ceiling. So the United States comes back, wants to reopen the whole thing, renegotiate all this stuff. India analogously makes the strategic decision to come back, the political decision to come back, and then wants to reopen the whole thing. Are those analogous, and how realistic is that?
I can't speak for the US, but for India, I think it would be a question of what do you negotiate for the 20-year transition? And that is something that is between you and the other members. I mean, that's a negotiation. That's exactly what the negotiation's for. Not to change the RCEP itself. I don't see, because in effect, you have a really long transition period here. 20 years is, as you said, a low ambition agreement with 20-year transition. I think it's, as long as the government can politically say, look, I've managed to get better terms than I was getting. So I think India's problem maybe is a little less perhaps than the US's issues with CPTPP. I don't know, but that Mike has to answer.
I think there's a long and distinguished history of administrations renegotiating the trade agreements of the previous, and frankly, I think our trading partners have come to expect it of us. And so Clinton adding to NAFTA, Obama renegotiating Korea, Panama, and Colombia. I think this is sort of common practice. So obviously it depends on what's there. And as you recall, when the 11 other countries came together around CPTPP, they took out about 24 provisions that were of particular importance to the United States.
Yeah.
Almost in anticipation that we would insist on that and others as if we ever wanted to come back in. Again, I don't expect that to be the case. I think the politics have moved on. To Heng Chee's point at the beginning, not only has Asia changed, but the United States has changed. And I don't think we can really go back to the way things were necessarily. But I do think we can pick up particular pieces of it and build from there.
So it's mutual.
Mike, Mike, can I ask you a question here? China has announced that it is looking positively at considering positively to join CPTPP. Does it make it then a no-no for the US?
Look, I've often thought that the goal of TPP and CPTPP was to set standards at a high level for the region that China would have to compete with and would hopefully raise the bar for them in their practices around intellectual property, technology transfer, state-owned enterprises, subsidies, level playing field in terms of market access. Those issues are still on the table, and China, there's a long way to go, in my view, before China could meet the standards. And so if we were in a world where China was reforming its economy in such a way as to meet the CPTPP standards, that would be very noteworthy. I don't think we're in that world in reality. So it's one thing to say we're considering joining. It's another thing to say, and we're willing to fundamentally restructure the elements of our economy. Those are the issues that we need to deal with regarding China anyway, the US and the rest of the world. And I would think that a Biden administration will want to take up a number of those issues, some of which were part of our bilateral investment discussions at the end of the Obama administration, to get to what was intended to be a phase 2 agreement on this sort of fundamental structural issues between China and the rest of the world.
So I have two audience questions here that sort of implicitly question the idea of greater Asian integration. One is from Michael Crapon, and it picks up, Shankar, on your point about a concert of major and regional powers. And Michael says essentially the trend looks more like it's breakdown rather than concert. And then parallel question, it's directed at Shankar and Heng Chee, but basically says, is growing domestic nationalism and growing kind of internal navel gazing, in other words, the focus on internal problems, likely to affect intra-Asian cooperation? Is it strong enough to limit cooperation? So both of those questions are kind of pointing in the same direction, which is to question the idea of greater integration. One posits fragmentation among major powers. The other says domestic focus is what's going to prevent it. But either way, really questions the idea of greater integration. Do either of you want to take a shot at those?
Maybe I wasn't clear. What I said was late 19th century Europe, which is post-concert, after the 1848 revolution. It's when the concert broke down, when you started getting, Bismarck's continental, when you started getting the systems of alliances, Triple Alliance and so on. So I don't think Asia is heading towards a concert of Asia. No, not at all. What I said was a variable geometry actually at work. And that I think is probably the way to look at it in terms of structure. About domestic politics, yes, I think this trifecta of sort of the economic crash, COVID, and what we see in terms of, the lack of even of what I originally said of any ideological coherence in the world, that combination, I think, has led everyone to look inwards, to stress self-reliance, and domestic politics has become even more local than it was before. And yes, that works against economic globalization and the kinds of commitments that we're talking about. But I think ultimately our self-interest will kick in. And, when we need jobs, we need the economies to get going again. Where do we look for this? And for India, there's no question. We do best when we're most connected to the world. That's what the record shows. And that's where I think we should go.
Heng Chee and also Mike,
Yeah.
just do you think countries, particularly coming out of the pandemic, are too internally focused to really drive mechanisms of cooperation cross-nationally?
Well, I think in ASEAN, you see, first my answer to Satu. The regional cooperation is never easy, and the road is not a straight trajectory. Look at the European Union. Even there, and they're so strong on Europe being one. The nationalisms do arise, and they become caught in their own particular self-interest and promotions there. And you'll find this in ASEAN, but they will cooperate where they can. Maybe the ambition won't be as large as they want, but they will try it. And in the case of pandemic, ASEAN works best when there is a crisis. And in the pandemic, they've been quite able to help each other. And we've been exporting vaccines here and there. I mean, it's been very open. We talk about keeping supply lines open, trade lines open. So I think we have imminent good sense during a time of crisis.
I would just add, I think that the crises, that the various crises we're managing right now have really underscored for people just how interconnected we are and how much international cooperation is necessary. But it's also, I think we've all got to come to the realization that we've got powerful domestic politics, populism, nationalism, nativism, protectionism, whatever one wants to describe it, that need to be taken into account, and other countries need to respect that too. And I think domestically, of course, the incoming Biden administration has made clear, and I agree with them, that they've got to focus on getting the domestic house in order first and foremost. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be engaged in COVID, in climate change, and in helping to make sure that the global economy recovers in a more resilient form through this crisis, and in a way that we help address our domestic imperatives as well.
Do you think there's a political appetite domestically in the United States? Just kind of, trade agreements, you have to sell them at a retail level. Is there a political appetite for the United States to be the driver of regional, much less global standard setting on any of this stuff, or are the political barriers just too high now?
My personal view is bringing a traditional free trade agreement to Congress, necessitating broad public support, is very difficult in this environment. But I think there are a number of areas where being involved in helping to set standards, to set rules, it can be done, and can be done in a way consistent with the existing politics. And even as we're, of course, addressing our domestic challenges as well. But would I recommend that we negotiate some giant new regional trade agreement that requires congressional approval? No, I wouldn't. I think the politics have changed. The world has moved on, and we now need to address how to, again, continue to raise standards and address the new issues facing the global economy in this political context.
Yeah, there's a question here from Shihoko Goto, and it's about the relationship between trade integration on the one hand and political cooperation on the other. And the way he's framed it is to posit a connection. So he asks, could trade integration without the United States lead to greater political cooperation without the United States? In other words, the US remains the security player, security provider, but there's all this economic integration happening on a Pan-Asian basis. So does the latter threaten to erode the American role on the former, or are these moving on bifurcated tracks? Maybe I'll start with Sean. Maybe we'll just do a round of all three of you. Shankar, do you want to take that on?
Well, I think the demand
could greater
for
Asian economic integration lead to?
Yeah. I don't think so, because the demand is there for both your American economic involvement and for the US as a security provider. And of course, the US as a norm setter in both. And that demand actually has grown. The only question is now whether the supply is available or not. And I think that's the doubt in people's minds. So I don't think these are actually heading in contradictory directions at all.
I think in Asia, Evan, there's still a great desire to see the United States come back, but how are you coming back, you see? So that's why I say you have to consult, you have to listen, and, it's a different world. Because you are still the most powerful economy in the world. You have high tech and technology, still the leader. I saw a survey of leading researchers in technology, and if you pick the 12 most advanced industries, the researchers will say America leads in 11 of these 12. So you are a leader in technology, you've got a great market. You haven't invested in the region as much as you should. Japan is number one in ASEAN, Singapore is number two. China is not there too, is much. In fact, Chinese investment in ASEAN is much less than everyone thinks. So I think there's room for America too. We do want America to come back, and we would like to see an American presence, but America too must take into account the new Asia.
And within the region itself, could this economic integration and standards integration lead to political cooperation, especially among erstwhile rivals, China, Japan? I mean, think about RCEP. You've got China, Japan, South Korea all in the agreement. Could that lead to political cooperation or no?
Political cooperation between the three is a little harder. I think it is hard, so that won't happen. But my sense is in the region, and I've said this earlier, United States, there's greater trust in the United States as a security partner. We wish you would be more, we could read you more and you're more reliable, but there's trust in the United States, so you have that advantage.
So economics and security on largely parallel tracks, not integrated tracks. Our presumption about that will continue.
Right now, they are on parallel tracks, and will they come back together? China is very firmly on an economic track. You can't dislodge China there. And I think the region wants China to be a part in their economies.
Evan, I would just flip around the question the other way and say the opportunity is that as you come together around some set of issues, trade, standard setting, whatever it is, it creates habits of cooperation and has positive spillover effects for the nature of the interaction. It doesn't necessarily lead, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think there's a risk that as Asia comes together on their own, it's going to somehow diminish the potential role of the US in the region. But I do think if the US engages in a positive way in some of these efforts, it helps rebuild some of the strategic benefit of habits of cooperation and working together that have maybe immeasurable but important attributes.
So we're at time. So let me ask you a last question and then ask all three of you to address it. We have a new president coming in something like 46, 47 days. What do you think? How is the U.S.
41, but
41. What's your bottom line on how the U.S. is postured in the Asia that actually exists rather than the Asia that sometimes the United States talks about, the Asia that we've been talking? Are you satisfied with how the U.S. is postured for the long term in Asia? Or do you think there need to be big changes, incremental changes? How should the U.S. be thinking about its long term posture in the region? Mike.
I would say
after 4 years of
fundamentally, I think we're well postured both strategically, politically, and economically. We are an Asia Pacific power. We're going to remain an Asia Pacific power. I think the question is, how do we exercise that? How do we translate it into engagement and into action? And after the last 4 years, I think there's going to need to be, the pivot is still there. The rebalancing is still there. The question is now, how do you re-engage in a way that takes into account what's happened in Asia over the last 4 years and the changing perspectives, but also creates opportunities for the U.S. to exercise leadership in an appropriate way.
Shankar, is the U.S. well postured?
I think Americans tend to underestimate how well postured the U.S. actually is, both in terms of her attractiveness as a model, as a strategic partner, and her economic role in Asia. And, you know, we got used over a long period after the Second World War. We got so used to it that we started taking it for granted, we Asians. I think, in a sense, the last 4 years have been a wake-up call for us. And today, the US will find willing partners throughout the region. But we'll have to have a conversation about how and where we take this forward in this changed Asia that we face today.
Heng Chee, the last word to you.
Well, I agree with everything that has been said. And I agree that the region really would like to see the US back. Don't underestimate that sentiment. But they would like the US to be present in a very real way. You have to attend all the meetings. And I hope there is greater professionalization of the different services, the State Department and so on, by which I mean there are people appointed there. There are people you can talk to. There are people who will come out to the region to hear what the region has to say and carry this back to Washington so that can feed into your policy making, so that you are better positioned to deal with the new Asia.
Great. Well, that's a great way to leave it. So let me first thank all three of you. We appreciate your time. And especially now with the time zone change, I know it wasn't easy to coordinate this, but I appreciate you doing it. And that's a good way to leave it, which is the region is changing, but the US brings a lot to the region. And so the question is how to exercise leadership in the face of change and evolution. And that's the question that's going to be at the heart of this series as we take it forward. And I really appreciate you framing some of the questions for us and helping to kick us off. So thank you on behalf of Carnegie and our audience for this today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.